Hey there, everyone. Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all are joining us globally. I am Parthoru, Events and Program Manager for Microsoft Reactor India. And yes, I welcome you all to yet another episode of MVP Connect. But before we start our today's session, let's go through our code of conduct. We are all here to learn together, participate together. So please be respectful of other people's views, understanding the differences, be kind and considerate in a way we all engage. Yes, we do encourage you all to participate. Please drop all your questions in the chat section and we will pick it up from there. I would now like to bring in Kashish, who's speaker for our today's event and also a Microsoft MVP. Hey, hi Kashish. Sorry, I am on a ghost mode. I have a little issue with my cam today. How are
Sure,
you
no,
doing?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm I'm all good. Bangalore's weather is mesmerizing and it's time for a coffee. How about you? Where are you joining from?
I'm joining from Bangalore itself.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yes, Kashish, you can have a small introduction of yours and we'll get started soon.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so thank you so much for the warm welcome and thank you to everyone who's joined today. And I'm really excited to present this session today because it's going to be something interesting. And it's all about Docker and VS Code. But before I begin with the session, I would just like to give my brief introduction for today. So, hi everyone, I'm Kashish, and I'm founder of Digipod and also a Microsoft MVP. I've worked in companies like Amazon, Google Summer of Code, Mercedes Benz as a developer itself. So, about today's session, I want to keep the session a lot beginner friendly because a lot of people are trying to understand what Docker is and getting to know about its whereabouts. So, in today's session, I want to keep everything to a beginner level. So, even as someone who's starting in the session, even they can understand that. So, walking through the agenda for today, I want to start with what is containerization and Docker, moving up to setting up our first environment, to using Docker in VS Code and customizing our project in Docker itself. So, yeah, let's dive in and let's start with what is containerization. So, containerization means containers that are lightweight, standalone, and executable software packages. And that include everything needed to run a piece of software, the code, runtime, libraries, environment, variables, and even the configuration files. Containers isolate applications from each other and the underlying system, ensuring that they do not interfere with one another. So, how does container images work, right? So a container image is a portable package that contains software. It's this image that when runs becomes our container. So you can see that this is one of the integral parts of Docker. So the container is the in-memory instance of an image. The image serves as a blueprint for template or creating a running instance of the software known as a container. A container image is immutable. So that means it cannot be changed once published. Which is why once you have built an image, you can't change it. The only way to change an image is to create a new image. Now, this feature is a guarantee that the image we use in production, that is, when we deploy it, is the same as we are using in our development environment and QA testing. So, now the question comes, what exactly is Docker? We know what containerization is, right? But Docker is a software platform that allows you to build, test, and deploy applications quickly. A Docker packages software into containerized units called containers that have everything the software needs to run, including libraries, system tools, code, and runtime. So, Docker is basically a tool that we can use to perform a process called containerization. So we know what containerization is, we know what Docker is, but why Docker? Docker is a popular tool because it offers portability, consistency, and scalability for deploying application in different environments. Now, these are integral parts when you're building a startup from scratch or building your product from scratch because we want to scale it. And Docker containers are lightweight, isolated, and easy to deploy, making them a popular choice for modern application development and deployment. So now we know that they're isolated, lightweight, easy to deploy. But what does that even mean, right? So there are two kind of architectures we follow. One is monolithic and other is microservices. In monolithic architecture, what happens is, I think the internet is causing some issue for video, but okay. So in monolithic architecture, what happens is once the server goes down, everything linked with it also goes down. Take an example of a website, right? Once your website is published on a server and the server crashes, your website also crashes. Whereas in the case of microservices, let's take an example of a tree over here that has a lot of fruits over it. If one fruit falls, it doesn't mean that all the fruits will not fall or will fall. That doesn't really connect the two things, right? So the fruits will be healthy and will be able to eat. They will be edible, even if any of the fruit falls, which is the case with microservices. All our code is containerized. Let's say, let's take an example for Instagram for here. If there's a code snippet for the feed section and there's a code snippet for explore section, for instance, if one of the processes fail, it doesn't mean that the other process will also fail. So microservices isolate one software, and that ensures the integrity for the software, which is why we want to containerize our software, and it is becoming a new industry practice. So, coming down to the real part now, I don't want to keep it more theoretical but more practical. So, you get a good idea that what exactly is Docker and why do we use it. So, let's take a use case over here. So, suppose someone is working at an agency that does software consulting around many different languages and runtime environments. All developers are using VS Code, Visual Studio Code. And the company has dozens of projects in progress, each with its own configuration and runtime requirements. So, the developers at your agency need to work on any project without having to set up or configure their machines first. Which is why in this session, we'll add configuration files to any existing project. Now, it can be a Python project, it can be a Java project, it can be any project or in any language, it doesn't matter. And we're going to containerize it. And these files will tell Visual Studio Code how to build an environment where the project will just work. We also have to use the def container configuration to configure the runtime environment and automate configuration of a development environment that will also work for anyone who has Docker and Visual Studio Code. And we'll be able to configure any project so that it runs inside a Docker container. So I'm just going to share my VS Code screen and we'll just start with the containerization. I hope the screen is visible. Okay. So we will be working with a Python project here that shows a dashboard of products. To run this project in a container, you will need a def containers extension for Visual Studio Code. Now, to get an extension or to install an extension in Visual Studio Code, we have to go to these four squares over here in the tab and click on it and just search for the extension name def containers. For me, I have installed the extension already. You please feel free to go side by side with me during this project. And if you want to install the extension, you can install it sidewise. So for me right now, because I have installed this extension, it is showing to uninstall, but you can install it and come back to the media page. Okay. So once that we have installed the dev containers extension now, we are going to take a look at how it's going to help the developers. Basically, the scene right now is that we have an agency and we have a bunch of developers. And we want all the developers to work on the same project. Now, I cannot go around and expect every developer to configure their machines, because someone might be having Python on their machine and someone might not be having Python on their machine, and which is going to create a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos. And to eliminate that, we are going to use a universal way so that they can just run it and there are no chaos. So now that we have installed the dev container extension, we are going to take a look. So it can be a major hassle, like I said, developers to get started with new projects in any company. So each one requires developers to install and manage specific complicated sets of dependencies and technology stacks. Ideally, each project should be contained in its own pre-configured containerized environment, which is an ideal case scenario. And Docker and Visual Studio Code make containerization and development possible through the Dev Containers extension. So why exactly this extension is because for Visual Studio Code, it lets you use a container as a full-featured development environment. You can use this extension to open any folder or repository in a container itself and take advantage of all the full feature sets of the Visual Studio Code, like IntelliSense, Copilot, debugging, navigation, etc. So the how the extension works is it lets you grab a dev container with a specific technology stack like Python, JavaScript, or any other, or dependencies already set up for you. So you just have to open a project and find that your code just works without downloading any external packages. So if someone might have used Node.js, they know that to install any other packages, they have to install with npm and the package name. So if we pre-configure something like that beforehand, so every developer doesn't have to keep on installing the packages again and again. So it doesn't become a recursive task, and the developer can really focus on the development or coding part. So it connects Visual Studio Code to a running container. And our workspace files are just mounted from our local machine. So if I have, so if you can see, if these are my local files on my laptop right now, these will be mounted on the container once I run the extension. So they are copied or they are cloned into the container itself. So Visual Studio Code extensions are installed and run inside the container only. So there they have full access to the tools, platform, and file system. So they can even access our files. To you, as in the developer, the experience is the same as if you had just opened Visual Studio Code. It doesn't feel like that you are using Docker externally, but it feels like a part of it. So you cannot actually feel the change, but you are actually using a container, which means you can seamlessly switch your entire development environment just by connecting to a different container. So if let's say we have two containers, we can seamlessly switch from one to another. From let's say one is Python, another is Java, so we can just switch our containers from there. The extension handles all of the setup based on a few configuration files like devcontainer.json contained in a folder, and we're gonna soon see that. So I'm gonna come back to VS Code here, and okay, we are going to press F1 and we are going to add the dev configuration files, and we can add it to our workspace. You can also go for user data, but I'd like to go here for a workspace because, as it's saying, this allows you to share the configuration with a source control. So I want the source control to happen, so I'll just add it to the workspace. And because this is a Python project, so I want a Python environment for this project. So I think I can go with Python 3 and the default bullseye. And once your environment is selected, we can just click on OK, and it will here start adding the dev container. And now it's asking to reopen in container itself. So let's open in container. At this point here, opening remote, this means it is cloning or copying your local files into the container. And now where this is where you can see that there's a new folder called dev container, which has a different file, dev container.json. Now this is our major and main file. Now, if you look closely, it has some options over here, and we're gonna see how exactly they are going to configure and set our whole project. So the dev containers extension does this only. It uses a CLI. And the CLI ingests the dev container JSON configuration file, and it creates or configures a dev container from it. The dev container CLI is also referenced or implemented for development container specification. So when you're setting up the dev container for a project, you will need to add a container configuration that we have just done by pressing F1 and adding the configuration file and setting up our Python environment. So this will be added to your project, and Visual Studio Code will notify us, which is right here. If this is something over here is coming onto your screen, that means you're now in a container and not in a local environment. So if we can inspect it, like we just saw, there's a dev container JSON file. There are a lot of things over here. So we can even access the terminal from there. So for terminal, you have to, on Mac, you have to press Control Shift and hyphen key. And if you're going to notice, this is not the usual terminal that we face in Visual Studio Code. This is slightly different. And this is what is indicating us that we are in a container now. So if now I want to, let's say, check the version for my Python that I've just created, the environment that I just created, I can just write the Python version, and it is going to tell me that now, right now, I'm using 3.12.3 version of Python. Either way you can try. Like if I want to now check, because we are in a container on my local machine, I have a package called brew, but let's see if container is able to fetch that. It's not able to fetch that because right now we are in container, not on my local machine, which is the whole point. So let's check out the project right now. We have here something called app.py. Now, if you have built something in Python, you know that app.py, or there's an entry gate in a Python web app from where you can access and run the app. Now, let's say I want to run this app over here. So I'm just going to write Python app.py, but it's not going to run. And the problem here is that it is not able to find a module called Flask, which means we have to now install the module, which is something that we can use from the requirements txt. So if we use something like this, pip3 install user r requirements.txt. So if I press enter right now, it is going to install the dependencies that I have in my project. Right now my dependency is Flask, so it's going to install Flask in my project. So I think we can try to run this project now. Python app.py. And here it works. So when you get a notification like this that your application running on port 5000 is available, that means your project is up and running. So I'm just going to exit it now. This is a confirmation that the project is running. So till here, I think great work. We have a Python web application with Flask running on our machine, and we might not even know that these things even are needed. And that's okay. You don't have to even know the container at the backend is handling everything, the entire environment. So you have set up a dev container, right? It will also now just work for anyone who has Docker and the dev containers extension. The main thing here was dev containers extension. But they'll still have to install some dependencies, right? We only don't need one package or one thing in our project. When we're building a web app, we need different dependencies, different softwares, different modules in it, right? But we might also need some other Visual Studio codes. That's like, so for some of us, we use Copilot or we use linting or other stuff. So for that, even if I now want to use some external extensions, then we can use it in the container itself. Fortunately, we can also fully customize and automate all the project setup by using the dev container.json file. Like I said, the dev container.json file is a main configuration file. So if we want to add or remove something, that has to be done through dev container.json file. So if we now take a closer look in this file, the first thing that we see here is the name, the environment that we have set up, and the image that it's using. I selected bullseye. So it is showing me the image that I'm using right here. But there are also a lot of things over here that are commented out. These are not just comments, these are actually things or code that we can use in our JSON file. So let's look at the main options in the dev container.json file. And the image property in here defines how the container will be created based on what's known as a container image that we discussed earlier. And the image, which is mcr.microsoft.com python 03.11, that is also our image name. That is exactly our container image, which is the package we were talking about. And the images in this repo are all pre-built images, which will speed up your workflow and result in a simpler .dev container or JSON file configuration. You can also use files known as a Docker file or a Docker Compose file. If you're someone who has some advanced knowledge of Docker, then you can always use a Docker file or a Docker Compose file to configure your own setup. But right now, for this project, we are going to use pre-built images. So for that, we have used Microsoft MCR Python. These files can live in your dev container folder and allow you to further configure certain setup requirements, like installing additional softwares. Now, the other thing that we have in this here is the features part. Now, what do we mean by features? So the development containers or features are self-contained shareable units of installation code or dev container configuration. And the name comes from the idea that referencing one of them allows you to quickly and easily add more tooling, runtime, or library features into your development container for use or by you or your collaborators from your team. And when you use the VS Code command dev, pressing M1 and F1, and you use the dev containers configuration files to your container, you're presented a list of scripts to customize the existing dev container or configurations such as installing Git or Azure CLI or any other. Then also we can add some project settings here. We can also use GitHub code spaces in this. As an example, you can use set VS Code settings to copy machine specific settings into the container itself. So if I have some other kind of local machine settings on my system and they are contained in a file, I can just switch it or copy or clone it to my container. So the container will also have the specific environment. And you might have these settings in your own Visual Studio Code setup. And by adding them to the settings, you ensure that anyone who opens this project, this specific project here, faces or gets the specific VS Code settings. So they don't externally or explicitly have to do that on their own. The pre-built image does it for them. In this Python container, you can see that these settings or the base image here, this Microsoft.com/Python 03.11, they give the user an improved Python editing experience. And you can use the extensions array within the customizations. Now, VS Code property to specify which Visual Studio Code extension should be installed in VS Code, it connects the containers. Your normal Visual Studio Code setup and all the extensions that are already there have won't be present and when you're using dev containers, which is why we have to copy them explicitly sometimes into the container. Now there's something also called here post create command. Now this is something we are going to use and this is something which is also very important. So the post create command property lets you run any command that you want after the container is created. So right now our container is created, and if you remember from the first or the previously what I spoke about, that we had to install Flask, which was right here in app.py. If you can see, there's a Flask module over here, and we had to explicitly install it by writing pip3 command that we did just here. So if we want not the user or the developer to do it again and again, and we want it as a predefined setting for our container, so we can use something called as post create command, which is here. This can allow us to automate our task so that the developer or the user doesn't have to explicitly or recursively download it or set it up. And the last thing we are going to do right now in this project is we are also going to customize it. So the dev container file here helps you configure various settings, right? So we are going to configure a Python extension that can help us lint the project perfectly. Because right now even there are some rough edges here and we want to set up our tasks so that we can further automate everything. So first, let's start by customizing our project. We're going to search for another extension and its name is Jinja, which is this one. Again, please feel free if someone is going side by side, you can install it. And because I've installed it, so it's asking me to uninstall. But yeah, this is the extension and you can install it. Once you have installed, you have to right click on the list from the list name here, and there's an option called as add to dev container.json, and we have to click on this. And once you have done this, there's an option coming right here that it's asking us to rebuild the container. But before rebuilding, if you can just check and come to your dev container.json file, you can check that earlier there were just two options coming here, but now it is also showing us our customization that we have added, which is an extension. And the extension added is Jinja extension. So right now, a developer who's setting up the project for the first time has to know that they are supposed to run the pip3 install for the packages. But once we do that, they don't really have to do it. It is automatically done for them. And the container will automatically install a dependency, which is in this case is Flask dependency. And whenever a container is created, it will be just created. So why Jinja was installed? Because if you come to here in the project directory, if you come to the templates folder and you go to the index.html file and we scroll down to line 33 here. So you can see that this is not an usual HTML code. This is a template for Jinja, which is a templating engine for Python. So this is basically a Jinja template file, and we want it to be read during our project, for which we used our extension over there, and it is visible over here. So notice that you didn't have to install any dependencies, right? So I can just go to F1 and just rebuild the container over here. And it worked. So this is how you automate a task so that you don't have to manually do it recursively. So our container is now customized and automated. So till now, what we have done, we have set it up a project. We have also automated it, and we have also customized it. Let's do one more automation here. So for automation, like I mentioned, it was post create command. Now, if I uncomment it and put a comma right here, so what this will do next time when I'm going to rebuild my container, this command will run automatically again, and this will install the external dependencies of my project. So I'm going to save my JSON file and press F1 and rebuild container. And it is installing our dependencies. So my dependency was Flask. So right now I didn't have to explicitly type it. It is doing automatically. So we can try to run our project now. And if this notification comes up, which means our project is up and running. So this was the second step where were we able to automate, customize, and set up our project till here. So that was the beauty of it, that we were able to automate our container itself also. So the container is now customized, automated, and for our agency, if any other new developer now comes, they just have to install this one container from us, and everything that is contained in it, these all are customizations, are automations, they'll be just copied to them, so they don't really have to actually set up their local machines. It will be pre-built and pre-set up for them. Doing this, it really cuts off a lot of tasks from the developer side, and they can really focus on the coding part, and it is easier. So once we are done till here, now let's see one more thing. We don't just have to automate things and just cut tasks. We also have to build things, right? So what about we want to add new packages or new software to our container? So your customized container is coming along well for the company till now. And with the power of these dev containers, you have been able to add a pre-configured dev container right here that we saw. And through the like the tasks so far, you have been able to customize your experience for the developer till here. So, an additional software might include another technology stack or anything that you want to add, or any specific tech stack that the company is using, which can be here Node.js. So, for instance, we might want to use Node.js or any other package in any of our dev containers because we know that's part of our development workflows. Any of the web apps can be using Node.js for us, right? So when we want to run Node.js, we want to go to F. We want to press F1 on our keyboard and type configuration files again right here. So this is one way to install our files that we want to go, and we can just go for Node.js, or if I click on it, it will show me all the definitions right here also. But if you want to go through an easier way and a more shorter way to install external packages or external softwares, basically, we can also use apt-get or run apt-get update first, and this command will update the list of packages and package repos so that you have most current list cached. And however, if you make changes to your container folder, you need to rebuild your container every time, and you will have to reinstall everything you have installed manually. So if I'm doing something manually first, I have to keep reinstalling it. That's the case. To avoid this problem, you can use the post create command that we just used. And for the software features, these are self-contained shareable units, and installation code or dev container configurations are basically what we're going to use here. So the name comes from the idea that referencing one of them allows you to quickly and easily add more tooling runtime or library features into your development container for use by you or your collaborators. So when you use the VS Code command, def containers, add configuration files, you are presented with the list and all. But if you want to go with something shorter, as we can see here, there is something called as features right here. And if I uncomment it here, so I'm presented with something like this, which means it is also a part of the code itself. And if I want to add my Node.js through this feature here, so I can just paste it. And this is what is going to get us our Node.js image. Again, I have command S like control saved, and we are going to now rebuild our project again. So if you can check the node version, and if you want to make sure that the correct version is installed here, we can just open up our terminal right here. Let's wait for it to finish first. In most of the cases, it takes a little time when we are rebuilding. So if we are adding more and more things, it will take a lot more time than before. And likewise, till the time it is building, and it has built. So not even Node.js, we can use any package we want to install through this method. We can just mention it over here that the version I wanted the latest, and the file that I wanted to incorporate in this project for now, which was Node.js. And we are back over here. So if I want to now to check which version am I even using for Node, I think we can write Node version here. Let- Let's try to rebuild this. I think it's not showing up for now. And if we try to run our project, let's try for that. And it works. So let's see how our project actually looks that we have done till now. So I'm going to open it in the browser and let me just share the screen once more over here. So I hope the screen is visible. And this is the project, how our Python project looks for now. This was the web app, and now it's been hosted on 5000 port over here on my local host. And that was all about customizing, automating, and installing a new software in our Docker container. And with that, let's really congratulate ourselves because we were able to customize our web container or our dev container even further by installing additional softwares and customizing it. So till now, till here, you have created a standard environment for the developers in your, like, a use case was for the agency, right? So till now, we have been able to create a container for the developers in our agency who will work on the Python products dashboard, which was just right now, which we were seeing. And now any developer can immediately open, run, and work on this project. And you have also learned how and why you would use a container as a development environment, installed dev containers extension and in the Visual Studio Code and its commands also. So these commands included adding container configuration files, reopening your app in a container, and rebuilding a container after making changes. And we have also explored the files that make up your container configuration, which was the defcontainer.json file that we just saw, in which we were making basically all the changes. And we were also able to customize our container and by forwarding ports, which was port 5000, where we were able to forward it. And I would again like to share my screen for another thing. And I hope the screen is visible. Okay. So till now we have done all these things that I just mentioned: customizing, automating, setting up, adding softwares, etc. So let's see one thing. Let's check what we were able to retrieve or catch during the session. And I would really like to the people to turn up their attention span for now and look at the screen. And here is one question over here that after you have added a dev container configuration to a project, that is when we added the dev container, how do you open that project in the container? So these are the four options. Please feel free or actually retrieve the right answer and drop it in the chat box below. We'll take about 10 to 15 seconds for this. And after that, we're going to see, this is not a test. This is basically you just checking how much have you been able to catch through the session. And in 15 seconds or just 10 seconds more, we are going to see the right answer for this. So your options are basically the project automatically opens in the container. Did it happen? Just recall 1 hour back. Select add development configuration files from the command palette, or use the reopen in container option in Visual Studio Code, or start the project from the terminal. Again, this is not a test, so I'll just move to the answer so that you can check, which was use the reopen and container option in the Visual Studio Code. So once we were rebuilding our project, a pop-up was coming that you have to reopen or rebuild your project. So this was the pop-up that came, reopen in container. So this was the right answer. One more question we have. Please feel free to use a chat box and drop whichever option you feel like is the right one. So, how do you run additional commands after a def container has been created? And your options are on the screen. Use the post create command property, which was in the def container JSON file. Use the post install hook in the def container file. Specify the command in the Docker file, or pass the post create flag to the command. We'll again take around 10 seconds for this, and please feel free to drop the answer that you feel is right in the chat box. And time for the reveal. This was the right answer. Use the post create command property in the def container.json file, which I think was the first option. So, whoever had the first option, it was good you were able to do that. For the rest, they can try it once and they'll get a better idea. I know this is a little overwhelming when you are just presented with a bunch of questions after just after the session, but it's just to know how much you were able to catch, so you can self evaluate yourself. So, moving on to the third question and the final question. So, how would you install additional software in a container so that it persists your changes even after rebuilding? And your options are again on the screen. Use an apt get command in the def container.json files post setup command option, or use the apt get command in the docker files post setup command option. Install the software after the container loads via the terminal, or use a def container feature. You can drop the option number, or you can type it out. I mean, typing out will be a long thing. You can feel free to drop the question, like the option number in the chat, and we'll again take around 10 seconds for this. And time for the answer reveal. And the answer is user def container feature, which was the fourth option. So that was all from my side today. I hope you all were able to understand and get some idea how to actually containerize your projects within VS Code itself. So even if you are new to Docker, this is an actually very easy approach to containerize your project. And even and like using a container, you can even push it to your GitHub repository, and from there someone you can even open source it and people can use your containers remotely. So that's one thing, and that's like a bigger thing, but we're not going to go there, but that's just one option you can proceed with. So that was all for today's session from my end. And
Thank
um,
you, Kashish. Thank you so much for the beautiful session.
yeah,
And we have few questions. Would like to take it up.
sure.
Yeah. So there is a question from Harsh asking like if he has to pull a Docker image from internal Docker registry. So
Okay.
he just need to change the image URL in the Docker container, that is .json file, or is that the only configuration required?
That is the only configuration required. You just have to change the URL, because right now also what we were doing is we were taking the URL from the registry only. These are pre-built images. So if you want to change them, just change the URL.
Okay, so this one more question from Harsh again.
Okay.
Like, how do I set container size related configuration?
Okay. What exactly, I would like to question that container size related configuration. If you want to set, you can even do it from the configuration JSON file only that we were having in the dev container folder. But that really is not, the size is actually not a big problem over there because we are actually using a very lighter option. So I think that has to be done. If you want to set the size and all, you have to go through the Docker file, which is you need to have some advanced options or advanced knowledge over there. And you have to play around with the Docker file and then you have to come over to your VS Code. I don't think you can explicitly do it in VS Code itself.
Okay, and we have the last question from Beatrice Ram Souza. He's asking like if he's doing a project solo, is it worth to use a container?
Um, See, if you are doing a project solo, by which I am assuming that you want to keep your project only available to yourself, then I don't think there's that big of a need. I mean, it's always good to go with a container because it's lightweight and it takes lesser space. But if you want to like scale it, or actually, one thing, if you want to like take it to some recruiter, or even better if you want to open source your project, then this is the best approach you can go with, because most of the open source projects, if you look around, are dockerized or containerized. So even if you're at a student level right now, you want to create your solo project, but if you put out a container out there, which is an industry practice, I think your project is gonna be much, much better, because it's going to go to the recruiter as if the person knows the industry standards to a certain level. And you can even open source it, so that's always a plus. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Kashish. Thank you so much for a beautiful session.
That- Thank you so
And
much
yeah,
for
he
having me.
Harsh says like he got the answers. Thank you. Yeah, yep, yep. So meanwhile, I have also sent a learn doc, which can help to take your learning further. So please visit the website and complete your learn modules. That will help you to take your learning further. And yes, thank you, Kashish. Thank you once again for being such a beautiful host. And yes, thank you, and
Yeah.
thank you all once again.